Welcome back. This is Spanky Gibson at Spanky Gibson Produces. Today I wanted to talk about how strong leaders are made. You know, I'm pretty much focusing most of my attention on trying to share my years of experience in leadership and in and outside of the military. And, I just want to, I just see a lacking. And, I'm not knocking on anybody out there in the real world, but the type of leaders that I had seen after I'd left the military after 22 years of service, they lacked on some key characteristics. And those characteristics I think are pretty important. A strong leader, they give an organization an edge. They take vision and then they turn that into execution. And not just, that leader could be a leader of one, leader of themselves, but they still have to have that key vision, and then they have to execute on that vision. And a strong leader is going to give, and especially an organization, a lot of, a lot of benefits. They're going to create resiliency within that organization. Based on that resiliency and based on their performance, they're going to shape a reputation. And as that reputation grows, it's going to bring in, not only a lot of new customers, but it's going to attract a lot of new talent. And in the point of bringing in that talent, it's going to be natural stepping up leaders that are going to follow behind, and then you're going to have this progression within the organization and make that organization grow, which is no different than the military. In the military, depending on the type of unit someone's with, strong leaders are going to bring in strong followers, and those strong followers are going to become strong leaders. And you're naturally going to groom those individuals that are going to take over your position. And, back on the factor of a civilian organization or, dealing specifically in job performance of a team that you might work, say something like sales, those strong leaders and that strong reputation, it's going to definitely bring in stronger customer relations. Your sales numbers will go up, your bonuses will increase, and you will bring in a lot of new business. Now, if I could ask you at this point, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I would ask you to. And I would also ask you to stay to the end of this video and, and then comment and give me some feedback on what you think of these topics and these characteristics of a strong leader. But I'm going to give them to you in not specific order, and they're all proven characteristics, inside, outside the military, probably more so on the civilian side or in your standard job environments. And all of these characteristics can be learned over time. Anyone can do it. Someone that can't speak to somebody, all the way up to someone like me that doesn't mind speaking to anybody. Unless I have this thing, if I'm not cold, wet, hungry, or being shot at, I'm pretty happy in life. I'm gonna enjoy your time, and I'm gonna want to talk to you. And then I'll pick up on someone that is not interested in having dialogue, and that's fine. So beyond the learned characteristics, they have to be refined over time. Something that we did when I was on recruiting duty from 1999 till 2002, we used all civilian sales techniques. Well, in the process, even when I had been, recruiter of the year, I've been meritorious promoted, I was stepping up and being looked at to being a leader of our office, what we call an NCOIC, a non-commissioned officer in charge. I still had to refine the skills. We still practice. And once I had recruiters under me, we did mock interviews. We went over questions and answers that might come before us and, cause a young recruiter to slip up. And, what doing those mock interviews and doing that training and refining those skills, it definitely strengthened me as a leader and then strengthened my recruiters as as becoming more proficient in their job. And then eventually some of them were going to step up. They were going to take over my position, and they were going to do the same thing with the new recruiters that came on board. And In the process of that, one of the number one things we do, and like I said, these are not in any specific order. It doesn't matter the order, it just matters the key characteristics that are involved. The first one's building trust. For me, if my folks behind me, if they did not trust me, then anything and everything I said wouldn't have mattered. If I wouldn't have proven myself through my own performance, they wouldn't have believed anything I told them. So that trust factor is critical. And that's everywhere in the world. That's even in your family life. A dad lies over and over and over, or they fail to follow through. What are their kids going to do? Their kids aren't going to trust them. And that's a very sad situation. And no different than your friends. Your friends ask you to help. You don't help over a period of time, they're going to quit asking you to help because they don't trust you. Second, I would say your integrity. And that integrity has to be decisive and you have to take action on it. Integrity, for a lot of people might not understand it, is not only that trust factor, but the honesty factor, combined. And then over time, people saying, if he says he'll do it, he will do it. That's integrity. Now, another huge one is communications. We all know in life you cannot get away from communications. It is in every facet, in every environment, from the beginning to the end of our life. And when you can communicate, then you're able to take that compelling vision that you might have as a strong leader and be able to pass that down. And when you pass that down, you're going to be clear and concise. And then another factor I think is probably pretty important, is empathy and care. Leading with empathy and care is I think important, more so out here than it would be in my past life. Being compassionate with people's needs, looking at their, maybe their demeanor in that day, especially if you've got somebody that's struggling and maybe they're struggling personally or they're struggling professionally, and you have to pick up on that. You have to be able to recognize, those actions and those activities and maybe step back and, ask them, what's going on. So, empathy and care, is another critical aspect. Then you got to be able to hold yourself accountable. If you know that you're slipping or you've got problems or you make a bad decision, you definitely got to say that was on me, not your team. Even if your team screws up, you've got to take that. You're the responsible entity. You accept it. Another key characteristic is, being able to adapt on the fly, adapt to change. You might have a plan. You might have given that plan to your team and something organically changes. And when you do that, you're going to have to, what we would say, turn on a dime. You're going to have to be able to re-communicate a different direction, maybe reorganize the task very, very quickly. And as you become a stronger and stronger leader, those skills will get a lot better. And then in that process, and your experience base, you'll definitely be able to turn on that dime. And in that part of it, if you think about it, you're going to have to make timely decisions. If you're going to react to a situation, you're also going to have to make a decision point on that. Empowering others is another key characteristic that you should do. I was talking about a little bit before, you're going to want to groom your team behind you because say you get out on sick leave or you have a child or you have to leave for a period of time, you want to be able to trust your team to pick up and carry on with those visions that you have and be able to accomplish those. That way you're not sitting at home trying to be a good parent and get through this whole new lifestyle that might have changed and then always be constantly micromanaging your team because you might lack trust in whoever took your position temporarily. So, empowering others, great characteristic. And I think that's failed a lot in the civilian jobs that I had. Everybody wanted to hold on to their position. They didn't want to give it up. And then finally, growth. Kind of like the training aspect of it and continuing to learn new skills. You've got to continuously be learning. You've got to have a lot of personal growth in the factor that if there's new things that are changing and new principles, maybe new ideas, you've got to maybe step away from something you've done for a long time and re-implement these new directions, and because they might make your performance better. And then obviously all of us have been out here in the real world, we know that a customer market might change. And when that customer market might change, you might have to change your procedures or your training to be able to redirect leadership in that way. So, continuing education. A lot of people, that have certain types of jobs like nurses, doctors, things like that, they have requirements. Well, leadership is no different. You continue want to step up and you want to learn, get new skills, make yourself better, constantly be improving. Because as that improves, you won't stall out, plateau, and you might not get in a lull of performance. Because I'm going to tell you, definitely in sales, that can lose you a lot of business, and people will notice those factors. So, remember, a strong leader, never one-dimensional. Constantly have to be moving forward, have a great balance in character, naturally be intelligent, and and some of that I'll say common sense, street smart. Might not be the smartest individual when it comes to intellect in reading or writing or other things, but common sense will bring you a lot of ways, because then you can read people pretty well and you'll still be able to understand how to lead your team and or react to your customer base. And then lastly, I think that a strategic vision is probably one of those best characteristics. Talking about vision and being able to execute that vision is critical. Now, if you like this information, please once again subscribe. Definitely comment. I need to know how my performance is here as a new creator. I need to know what you all think out on the street, what characteristics you look for, what characteristics you see in leaders you've had, and share that with me. And I'll share my thoughts back. And if I can grow off information you have, hey, one team, one fight. That would be amazing. But if you would just do that for me. But I just want to thank you all for watching this video. Once again, my name is Spanky Gibson. You can follow me on X at Spanky Gibson 71. My channel is Spanky Gibson Produces, and I also have a new one called Spanky Produces Clips. I'm going to put my shorts there. But once again, just want to thank you for being here, and definitely look forward. And you can see some of my follow-on videos. They'll be here at the top. You all have a good day.